We're going to be talking about Microchurch and the KC Underground. So I want to thank Brian and Rob for being with us today. I've been waiting for weeks to dig into this story with you guys. Now, those of you that watch the webinars are going to watch on demand. A lot of you know I'm from New Jersey, but originally I'm from Kansas City. So if they say an area and you see me nerd out, that's why. So you all are aware of that. But Rob, Brian, thanks for joining us. You guys have described your church as an innovative yet ancient form of church pursuing Jesus' mission in Kansas City. How you guys are the founders? Like, how did this all come about?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's really a privilege to be a part of it. It's fun to connect with you in particular with your roots in Kansas City, man. Go Chiefs!
Oh, yeah.
We may be the Super Bowl champions forever, thanks to coronavirus.
I know, that's what I was thinking. I think that's legitimate. If they don't play this season, we get the title again. That's just the way it goes.
Winners keepers.
Yeah. Well, I think, there's sort of the short-term story and the long-term story. I'll start with the short-term story. Brian and I were both on staff at a large church here in Kansas City, and they'd given us a lot of freedom. We were leading the global mission effort, and internationally, we were helping ordinary people learn to be missionary disciple makers, and they'd see these little expressions of the church emerge, and like a rabbit-sized church, and the rabbits were reproducing. And we were doing this around orphan care centers. And we basically said, hey, we want to do the same thing in Kansas City. And so we created some environments, intentional disciple-making environments to help people walk into that. And then slowly over time, we began to see really significant transformation happening in people's lives. They were actually becoming missionary disciple makers. And then as you start making new disciples, microchurches start emerging. And suddenly, there was this momentum, and about a year and a half ago, we were launched out of that church as an independent entity. And it's really not a church plant. The way that we look at it is we launched a mission agency in our city. So the analogy I usually use, if we were all going to go to, let's say, Papua New Guinea, and we were assigned a certain small geographic segment, and in a very small area in Papua New Guinea, you can have 200 tribes, but because of the geography, they're actually somewhat separated from each other. So they have different dialects and cultures and idioms. So if we were to go there, we probably wouldn't sit down and go, you know what, let's get a building, put it in the middle, and we'll start a weekend service and have amazing children's ministry, because we all stop and go, well, first of all, there's 150 different dialects. Which one are we going to pick? Second, we pick one, we alienate all the others, right? And they couldn't even they wouldn't even want to come. But if we could raise up missionaries in every single one of those tribes, and the missionaries plant themselves and they learn how to plant the gospel, well, Jesus is going to draw new people to himself. And then as new disciples emerge, then the church emerges. So we don't talk about planting microchurches. You don't really plant a microchurch because it's not about a meeting. It's about an extended spiritual family made up of new disciples. So what you do is you plant a missionary, you plant the gospel. So we launched this mission agency, and it's a platform to launch missionaries in microchurches. And then we network those microchurches and missionaries together. And so that's kind of the short-term story. Brian, what would you add to it?
I would just wonder if that was clear as mud. for those that don't sit in that paradigm.
You know what? That's probably the clearest explanation I've ever had of that, because I got to walk through and do some stuff with the Tampa Underground, and I remember spending most of the couple days I was there just trying to wrap my head around the concept.
Right.
And I think for me, the way you described that, and that's actually my question for you, how important is that language of saying this is not a church plant, this is a mission agency? Because when you put it that way, it's like everything kind of snaps together. And I know language is important. So how intentional was that for you guys?
Yeah, really intentional. I mean, from the macro to the micro, you know, from our conversation with our staff team all the way down to our kids. So early on, even while we were underneath this umbrella of a prevailing model church, you know, we began to re-paradigm the people that were with us. I always tell the story about my kids because it's an easy one to kind of help understand how important it is to create language early. You know, so they would ask questions like, "Are we going to church today?" And I'd say, "Well, you can't go to something that you are." And you know, they roll their eyes now. And but if they ask you that,
That's what my kids do too. Now it's like, Dad, we know, okay?
if you came into our house, our kids would say that to you. You know, like, "Hey, let's go to church." They go, "You can't go to something that you are." So it was really beginning to help people early on understand that we are the church. Like, we use that language from the pulpit. I've used that language in church forever. But our language often betrays us because we would say, you know, the body of Christ, that's the church. But then we would say, "Man, did you have a good service?" Or, "Man, we had church today." You know, so it's like we're still stuck in these two worlds. And so we were very intentional early on to say, we're not a church. We don't want you to think that Rob and I are going to start this new thing where I'm going to lead worship and he's going to teach and we're going to do what you're used to. Because if we gather you, we're still kind of in a model where we're pulling you out of your neighborhood or out of the pocket of people that you're gifted to reach or that Jesus has made you for or that he sent you to. We really want that mindset of sending back into. So all of our language is around that idea of we want to take missionaries and insert them into pockets of people or geographical areas and understand that this is the place you should be planted. This is the place I've sent you.
So, talk to me. When did it click for you guys that, you know, the traditional way you were doing church, it needed to be different and you needed to kind of create this kind of new thing, or just maybe reinvent the whole thing, you know? Like, you know, we think of mission agencies when you go to another country, like you were saying, but you're talking about it in the same city that the church you were is. And so what clicked for you guys? What made you say, hey, we got to do it this way?
To me, it was a slow process that started really in the early 2000s. I was in a very successful prevailing model church that we had been on fastest growing churches in America list a few times, you know. So we were seeing really great fruit, but I started noticing this dynamic of how the culture in America, the mainstream culture was ceasing to exist. There was kind of with the fragmentation of the traditional family, with the growing diversity in America, and the digital age that we're in, and the mobility of our society, it's like things are getting more and more tribalized. People are finding their identity in these smaller and smaller distinct tribes or pockets of people. And so that created this sort of, I guess what you'd call missiological tension, where it's like, there's more and more people, they're never coming to this weekend service. There's no way. Mm-hmm. They're just too culturally distant. You know what I mean? Again, it's like back to the Papua New Guinea illustration. Like there's so many clicks away for different cultural reasons that if they were to come to the weekend service, I'm asking them to do the missionary work, mm-hmm. rather than the people of God following Jesus' example, and we go and we incarnate and we do the work. So it was a slow process of saying, okay, our culture is changing dramatically. It's becoming way more diverse. So missiologically, we have to do this. And then the other thing was just biblically for me. Like I began to go deeper and deeper into personal reflection on my own ecclesiology. And eventually I arrived at a place where I was like, the most primal, essential form of church is the microchurch. In other words, just again, quick survey, church meets in the temple courts, meets in homes. Mm-hmm. The dynamic in the homes is it's the oikos, which is the primary social structure in the Roman Empire, which are networks built around family and work. You know, the best historians say they were 20 to 50. Like the gospel would hit oikos and it would get converted and turned into a microchurch, basically. And that form of church is the primary form of church in the New Testament. Like when Paul writes to the church in Rome, if you go to chapter 16, it's actually a network of 5 different microchurches, and he names all of them, you know. And if you start digging into the New Testament, you'll see it's really the story of Jesus living through a movement of microchurches. Like the microchurch makes the most sense of most of the book of Acts and the epistles. So that was kind of my journey.
Yeah.
Ryan, I know yours was similar. What would you say?
You know, a couple of things too, just to tag on to what you just said, the ability to live out the one another's of the New Testament. You know, the greatest place to do that is when a smaller group where you can actually love one another legitimately through the hard places of life, because we know the rough edges, and serving one another. Like the most meaningful place to do that is when it's in all of life, not when it's in sort of a sterile environment on an hour a week. But my journey was very similar in all of those things that he just mentioned, coming to an awareness and understanding the oikos and disciple making. And I know Rob can tell a similar story, but I would go to a specific story that was like this just clicked. Was standing in the driveway with my neighbor in Auburn, Alabama, where I was living at the time. And my wife and I had our first child. We've been in this house probably 2-3 years, something like that. And I only knew one of my neighbors. And he was a home brewer, and that was probably the only reason I knew him. And so we're like walking the neighborhood, and he called me up in his driveway, and we're standing there, and he said something like, "Hey, did you know, this is embarrassing. It's been a long time since I've lived there. The neighbor across the street, did you know her mom died? She was older, probably in her late 60s. And I was like, oh gosh, that's terrible. And I kind of looked away, and he said, "You don't know her name, do you?" I said, "No." And he said, "Man, that's the problem with all you Christians. You make loving people a job." And when he said that, it was this sort of immediate, I don't even know how to respond to that right now. And I told my wife, I said, "Hey, I'm gonna probably be here another couple hours." And he's like, no, I didn't mean to stir anything up. I was like, "No, brother, that just stirred my soul, you know." And so we went on a journey from that point on to understand, like, we cannot make working for the church a job where the only time we love people is when they walk through the doors, and then we're done when they leave. And so really our whole family converted then, and we began to live intentionally into our neighborhood, and begin to live these rhythms of, if we can't plant the gospel with our own neighbors, then we don't need to be leading anything else until that becomes our primary. And so, you know, we began reading everything we could and just trying to live into a new rhythm that aligned our life with the rhythms of Jesus. So this is another language you said is an important thing. It shapes culture. This is one of the phrases we use. We don't just need Jesus' message. We need his methods. We have to live like he lived among people.
Well, you know, I think that's so powerful. That I mean, I feel like secondhand shockwaves from your story, you know, because I think so often I think about the friends outside the church that I have that would never, wherever I've lived, that, you know, it would be a miracle to get them in once, but that's probably all you get them in. And how much more powerful would it be if we could just be the gospel, you know, where they are. And that's what I think is so compelling to me about what you all are doing. You know, it's this very intentional structuring around being the gospel where people are. And this releasing of, I love how you say it on your website, you know, we exist to inspire, engage, connect, equip, and empower ordinary people to flourish, with that flourishing spilling over into a mission where they live, work, learn, and play. And you know, that's only a piece of what you've got there, but I love that focus, because I think it's, you know, it's for my friend Mitch. He probably never watched this, so I'll throw his name out. My friend Mitch, you know, it's for the Mitches of the world, you know, the guy that we loved connecting with each other. But, you know, traditional church was kind of no longer for him. It doesn't mean the gospel's not. So that's powerful. Somebody threw out a question. I want to throw this question out, but then I wanted to take some time you guys have set this up really well, but I know a lot of people are interested in like, how does this look? How is it structured? What do you mean? You know, what's a missionary disciple versus a micro church and all that kind of stuff. So I'm looking forward to digging in. But somebody posted in here, do you feel like this model prepared you more for COVID season of open for service since June, but lots of families, people are still not coming, wondering if we're more connected by tribe neighborhoods, this church would look differently. What do you know, how would you guys answer that?
We were made for this is how we've answered that over and over again. I mean, we were designed in this, for moments like this. In fact, it's interesting, when we were under that prevailing model church and under that umbrella, we began to coach these missional people, these missionaries, into their neighborhoods and networks of relationships. And one of the ways that we re-paradigmed them was we would play this little game or experiment called the Designated Survivor. And so we'd have these little cohorts that were walking through this 12-month experience, and they had to take 1 week where it was like, hey, the comet landed, whatever, all the church buildings have blown up, Congress made it illegal for anyone to be a pastor. What do you do? What do you do in the first week? What do you do in the first 6 weeks, the first 3 months, the first 9 months, and come with a plan? And when COVID hit, we were like, oh wow, that experiment just got real.
It's no longer a thought experiment.
And so, it's like when you're in that situation, just some real life stories of, we have people in our microchurches that are, I'm blanking on the language, like they're higher risk. And so our people are like, I know that about you. Or I didn't have to find that out because of COVID. I already knew that your immune system might be compromised. How can I serve you tangibly right now? Can I grab groceries for you, leave them on your porch? Because we're designed to be smaller gatherings that meet in homes, when it is appropriate to do physical distancing, it's like you can meet in a backyard, and that microchurch is still together. But you can also break that microchurch up into smaller little units of people that might be literally right next door. Because of the network that we have, we decided to invest in, like any resources we had towards so many things that we might purchase. We just said, you know what, we're saving all that money, so let's spend a whole bunch of money on Zoom rooms. And so we were able to network with all of our microchurch leaders to say, if you're limited by a Zoom room for 40 minutes and screens and yada, yada, just send us an email and we'll set up your room for you. And you can go as long as you want and do breakout rooms and that sort of thing. And we're equipping those leaders on how to host, how to do a room, and how to keep their microchurch connected digitally if they can't be together physically at worst, So those are just a few of the ways that we were designed for it.
Yeah, and we have a weekly equipping gathering.
Yeah, I think it's huge.
To train the missionaries and the microchurch leaders. And of course, we moved that online immediately. And that equipping gathering, it's a combination of inspiration, which happens primarily through storytelling from the missionaries and the microchurch leaders. And then it's practical equipping for the microchurch leaders and the missionaries, kind of vision, huddle, skill. Well, we could do that. We just made a seamless transition online. And what we discovered is we actually saw an increase in participation because people are having to drive farther and farther from all over the city to come to our equipping gathering when it was in a physical location. Now all they got to do is go click and so it raised the number of people participating more regularly. And then also even the participation during the gathering, I noticed people who typically wouldn't maybe be willing to stand up and go to a microphone in the room will speak up on Zoom because it's like a flatter space, if you know what I mean. And everybody's looking at each other's faces and you're in your home. So I actually feel like the quality of our equipping it's gone broader and deeper. And we've actually talked about not going back even if it opens up completely, or going back to a once a month in real person gathering and the rest of it continue in the online equipping huddle. We haven't pulled the trigger on that yet, but it's been very effective. So, and we've actually seen disciple making accelerate through COVID. It's not slowed down. Like, we have microchurches emerging almost every week and a half of like new disciples through COVID. You know, we had a whole wave of missionaries that started online discovery Bible studies because COVID created a very liminal space where people are disturbed and uncertain and afraid, and they would just put the word out to their context where they've been living like a missionary if they hadn't started yet. Hey, I'm going to do this online discovery Bible study.
Yeah.
We're going to look at what Jesus has to say about fear and about hope. I'm not going to preach. We're going to go right to the Bible, discuss it together, see how it applies to our lives. And, you know, one couple, John and Heather, they had 6 people show up, 6 different families show up the first week.
Wow.
A week after that, he was taking the garbage out, and the person of peace in their neighborhood who's been there for 30 years and knows everybody, she's like, "Are you still doing that Bible thing online?" He said, "Yep." She goes, "All right, I'm going to be there next week. I'm going to bring some people." She brought 7 families. So that's 13 families from their neighborhood who are doing discovery Bible study, and now that's become a microchurch. You know, that's sort of a story that sort of embodies how microchurch is basically pandemic proof.
Well, I love that story. And then, you know, Michelle over here is asking some amazing questions, but I think it's going to lead in well to the structure question, because I think, you know, really interested in, okay, what does the structure look like week to week? What is a microchurch and how do you define that? But she says, what is the first step in going from a traditional church to a microchurch? Do you need a traditional church to back you in order for it to work?
Rob just popped the screen share.
Oh, this is awesome. I appreciate you bringing in the visuals. That's really helpful.
So I think this will help explain structure and also help explain what a meaningful transition might be. So Brian, you want to jump in with the missionary?
Yeah, but there's one step back from missionary that I would take, which is disciple making. Clear, definable language around what a disciple is and how you make disciples, how you know you've made disciples, and having a clear culture of disciples that know how to make disciples that can make disciples. So we'll just keep dropping our little phrases that we seed in our culture of.
Fundamentally, that's what a missionary is. It's a disciple who can make new disciples, new contact.
Be one who can make one who can make one. And we just say that over and over again. And so the heart of everything is we're making disciples that make disciples. But within disciple making is this understanding that, you know, the Father sent the Son, the Father and the Son send the Spirit, and the Father, the Son, and the Spirit send the church. So we're a missionary people, and we exist that way. Even when we become a microchurch leader and that we're a spiritual parent that's made disciples, we don't cease to be missionaries. We're a missionary where we live, work, learn, and play all the time. It's just that we've gone deep into one of those pockets where we've had spiritual conversations and the soil is soft, and we were able to plant the gospel, and we saw new disciples that were made. So again, it's that language of when we plant a missionary into a context and they embody the gospel, they proclaim the gospel, they demonstrate the gospel, new disciples are made as they give their lives to Jesus, and an extended spiritual family is formed. So it becomes this community that's on mission together, that worships together, and those are the rhythms of the microchurch. They're what we call the Ecclesial Minimum. So that's right at the center of that second image there of worship and community and mission. We can come back to the Ecclesial Minimum idea, but Rob, I'll let you take collective and hub.
Yeah, so it starts with people being mission sent. We never send anybody alone, so you're going to go in pairs. That's the minimum. Maybe teams into a new context. As you live like a loving missionary, make new disciples, and then a microchurch emerges, which is an extended spiritual family. And as microchurches emerge, we intentionally put them into networks. And so if you have a network of, let's say, 4 to 6 microchurches, we call that a collective. That makes sense for us in our context here in Kansas because we have farm collectives. So it's where farmers are working together in a region. So a collective of microchurches, you might have 4 to 6 microchurches that are from the same geography, or it might be the same affinity group. So maybe, hey, we've got 5 microchurches in West Shawnee, so that's going to be a network. We call it a collective, the West Shawnee Collective. Or it might be, hey, these are all people who are from kind of a formerly incarcerated background, you know. So that's Share the Hope. That's a network of 3 microchurches that have Discovery Bible Studies and 3 different jail systems that feed 3 microchurches. And then you can raise up elders.
It's not necessarily, when you're talking about this, it's not necessarily like always geographic or always tribal. It's just whatever fits, however these groups kind of come together is how they become a collective.
Yeah. So, and it's typically either by affinity, like they share an affinity group, like, hey, this is all Algerian refugees, you know, or this is all people that are coming out of the jail system, you know, and so they have that kind of affinity. Or it's by geography. And then you can raise up elders to provide oversight for that collective of microchurches. And then they can plan together for shared mission. They can even do shared gatherings if they want to. Not right now in COVID, but you could. And then the hub is the mission agency that supports, sends, multiplies missionaries and microchurches. And the hub, ours has 7 different equipping teams that provide all the services needed to launch missionaries and microchurches. And our vision for the city is basically, we want to see Kansas City filled with the beauty and the justice, the good news of Jesus. And we want a missionary in every street and a microchurch in every network of relationships. So long term, we think we're going to probably need about 20 hubs or more in the city so that every missionary and microchurch has a hub that's proximate to them and contextual for them. And we think we're going to need a minimum of 42,000 missionaries and probably 22,000 microchurches to get to that vision of gospel saturation.
Wow. And you guys are 1 year in. You've got, according to the website, and I love how you put the metrics right there on the website so you can track what's important. But your website says you have 82 missionaries in 1 hub. And so those 82 missionaries are all kind of scattered throughout Kansas City as a whole.
Right.
Yeah, we have what's called a missionary commitment. And that basically is when someone formally says, I'm committed, I'm mission sent, I want to determine what my mission context is. I'm going to live the blessed rhythms there. I'm going to plant the gospel there. And they self-identify as a missionary. And then when they make new disciples and a microchurch emerges, they can sign the microchurch leader commitment. So we don't count formally the people that are in the microchurches. Like, you know, people count weekend attendance.
Yeah.
If you counted the number of lives that we're touching through our 25 microchurches, it would be significant, you know. But we're focused on counting the missionaries in the microchurches and the hubs, because those to us are the kind of organizing identities that matter the most.
Yeah, that's actually one of the questions that I saw pop up is talk about your scorecard. So, you know, in the traditional model, it's the buildings, budgets, and the other B word. So ours is, we use this language of counting versus measuring. Counting is about how much, measuring is about how far. So we do both. You know, we do count. I could show you our spreadsheet where we count missionaries.
Bring up the spreadsheet, man. There's gonna be some people that love Excel. They're gonna.
I tell you what, you're gonna make some people very happy if you bring up the spreadsheet. You know.
Come on.
All right.
Crack it open.
I'm opening it up, but it's
helpful because I think the thing that stands in the way a lot is us not understanding, you know, we count the strategy and we don't count, you know, we don't look at our measures and then build a strategy around that. And I think that's one thing you guys have done really well is just, you've got measures for discipleship and you build a strategy around those measures and not the other way around.
Yeah. So we count microchurches, missional teams, missionaries, evangelistic discovery Bible studies, baptisms, and then we build this spreadsheet on, this is a microchurch that is specific towards their relational network is these guys that are formerly incarcerated or the addicted community. This is a specific neighborhood microchurch. This is the area that they are in the city. And so we can go down into each of those. This is John and Heather that Rob was just talking about. This guy is focused on the rodeo community in Western Kansas. This is kind of these drifting men that have been a part of the prevailing model church. This one's for the LGBTQ community. It tells us what's their coaching priority. Is it medium, low, or high? We know which coach is assigned to them, and then just some other information on those. And then we also have, these are our missionaries. These are the coaches that each of the missionaries has. So those are like the numbers. This is the counting that we do. And we're constantly updating this. We have a meeting each week where we talk about that. And then measuring is really important as well. So measuring is the idea of how far. So not just how much do we have, but how far are we going? So the time that we're with these leaders on a Sunday, we're asking stories. So we ask, where have you seen Jesus at work, and how have you joined him this week? And so you can track how people have moved intentionally into their neighborhood. You can hear stories of they're going, we met our neighbors for the first time. We're going, awesome, that's great. And then 6 weeks later, they're like, we had a meal. They all came over, and then 6 weeks later, they're going nuts because somebody's giving their life to Jesus. Like that's how far they've come in a 12-week period or whatever it is. Meals that you've shared, how have those grown more to look like the family of God gathering around the table? Or how has serving in your context become more meaningful and good news to the people? So like the serving early on might just be like, hey, we found out our neighbor was, they had a surgery, and so we took them a meal. That's a very practical way of serving. Yeah. But how far is like, now we know more of their story because we've had conversation together. Now we know they have this fear around, death in some way. And I've given them this book and began to walk them through like the good news that God is in control. And these are just some issues that's soul care around this idea of a fear of death. And I'm speaking good news based on what good news is for that person in my context. Like that's how far. So we're trying to train on how much and how far.
So I noticed a couple things stuck out to me. You guys have mentioned this a few times, the Discovery Bible Study. Is that kind of a core of what you're training the missionaries to do? Is that a one size fits all, or is it let me teach you the concept and then here's a few different Discovery Bible studies you can do? How does that usually work?
It's a powerful tool for planting the gospel, And so it's important in that it's a way of engaging the Bible that bakes in some very essential values, things like a discovery-based way of engaging the Bible. So we don't have a codependent relationship with a book or a curriculum or a professional teacher. We're teaching people how to go right to the Bible and to learn to hear the Spirit of God illuminate the scripture. And then it's also obedience focused. So you're working through these open-ended questions, but the last one is at the end of the content of engaging the Bible is like you write an I will statement. How will I walk into this and live this? Then you start next week revisiting the I will statements, and then it builds in reproduction, because at the end you're also asking, okay, who could you share this with this week? Which then gets people moving into their network of relationships, sharing from the scriptures. And so it's a very important tool that bakes in some values in terms of disciple making. And what we have found is when people live the blessed rhythms, begin in prayer, listen, engage, eat, serve, and then the story is sharing the story of the gospel and how Jesus has changed you. When you start having spiritual conversations with somebody, it's a very natural invitation to go, hey, would you like to look directly at what Jesus has to say? And I'm not going to preach at you. We're going to read his words together, and we're going to ask some open-ended questions and discuss it. And then when you're in that conversation at the end, it's like, Jesus said, if we actually do what he tells us to do, like run it like an experiment, we'll see that he's from God. So I know you might not believe yet, but what would it look like for you to try this out this week? Or if they do believe, it's like, well, we're disciples and we're taught to obey. So we're going to obey what we learned today. And what happens is those discovery Bible studies become like the embryo for a microchurch. We've seen that happen again and again and again. And Brian put up a website.
And when does it move? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Brian put up a website that we have created for missionaries in the underground that provides a really nice overview of Discovery Bible Study, and then also some great series of Discovery Bible Study to start with.
Oh, that's awesome. If you guys are willing and could share that link, we'll share that in the follow-up with people. If it's proprietary, totally understand that. But so I got a great question here, and then that'll lead into our next one. But it says, how do you balance the time needed to accomplish those goals with the timing of the Holy Spirit? Because obviously you've got goals that you all want to see accomplished, but how are you balancing that out with the rhythm and pace of the Holy Spirit?
I mean, our first question that we train every missionary on is, and the first phase of the missionary pathway is extraordinary prayer and fasting. And so the questions are the two baseline prayers. We actually have more tools on these prayers, but if you were to boil down the prayers that we train people on, the first two questions is, Jesus, where are you at work? That's a listening prayer. We train people on listening prayer. How do you hear from the Spirit so that you can align your life to his? And the missional prayer is, Jesus, how can I join you? Where are you at work and how can I join you? We pray these every day. It's a part of what we're doing. When we go into a coaching session, when we're going to hang with a neighbor, when we get up first thing in the morning before we go to bed, it's like we can't go forward. So I keep dropping these little one-liners that we have, but we can only go as far and as fast as we can on our knees. And so like they hear that language over and over. Like, we're not joking. We have a corporate rhythm of prayer and fasting. Of every Tuesday, we're inviting the missionary leaders, the microchurch leaders into prayer and fasting. So we say Monday night sundown to Tuesday night sundown. We're fasting together and we're praying together. We write a liturgy for that prayer time to guide them through that. We got to sign up on our website so they can click in and join us. But the baseline prayer is, Jesus, where are you at work? I want to join you where you're already at work in the context. That's often, I think, been what's missed in the West, is especially in church planting, especially in parachute drop church planting. I feel called to this city. I'm going to go in and I know the good news that they need. I'm going to go in and I'm going to bring them the same model that's already here. Instead of embodying the gospel, instead of living incarnationally and saying, what would be good news for the people in this place? Because good news for an urban core of Atlanta or Kansas City is going to be different than good news in Western Kansas or in the suburbs of Johnson County or in East Asia. And when I say that, people push back, because it's like, the good news is the good news. Absolutely it is. But the way that we speak that, right? And we talk about this, it's like when my neighbor loses their firstborn and they text me, my first response is not, well, if you believe in Jesus, you go to heaven when you die. That's really good news. I'm not diminishing that or devaluing that. So don't call me a heretic yet. It's the way that we arrive there and the way that we lovingly communicate that based on the moment of loss of a child, right? And it's like, how are their hearts open in this moment? How can I lovingly parent them through this moment? And so it's like Gospel Fluency is a resource that we encourage our missionaries with by Jeff Vanderstelt. So learning how to speak the gospel into the everyday stuff of life, not just leading in with what happens after you die, but what is good news and bringing the kingdom into this moment. So I took a really long time to say, Jesus, where are you at work? How can I join you? Is all about how we align with the Spirit. We don't go any faster than what we feel like he's going. And most of the time we can't keep up.
Yeah.
Even in our first year, we've spent most of the time equipping towards extraordinary prayer and fasting and how to hear the voice of the Spirit clearly through the scripture, through community, and through kind of that still small voice, how you discern it, then test it and obey it. And it's been very formative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it says in Ephesians 2:20 that the apostles and the prophets are the foundation of the church. And that's true in the church universal, but I also think there's something tactical to that for the underground, we've had a very strong focus this first 16 months on the apostolic and the prophetic, and that would be our foundation. And of course, we want to move into the entire fivefold, you know. But it's funny how effective we've been in evangelism, I think, by growing in the prophetic, which is listening to the Spirit and obeying.
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting because I know the question popped up, you know, what are some great resources to read? And you guys shared Jeff Vanderset's. But, you know, my question that's kind of like playing in the background is, do you have or have you connected with churches that have made a transition, that have said, hey, this traditional church thing's not working out. We want to transition more to a micro church focus? Because it kind of sounds, a lot of what you're talking about, it sounds like it begins with the mental shift and the focus versus structure. And I guess, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm far from the expert, but that's what I'm hearing a lot of what you guys are saying.
Yeah, microchurch is just a form, and it's important not to, you know, confuse the pathway and the function with the form. Like microchurch holds new believers and new disciple making. And, you know, we're not saying that disciple making hasn't happened in the West. We're just saying that it's often been unintentional.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't trained in not only formation into Jesus, but formation of how to form others. And so, like, the disciple making paradigm shift is probably like, that's step one always. And we have conversations with churches every week that are what we call prevailing model churches on what's step one to thinking microchurch. And it's always, if you don't have a disciple making pathway and a disciple making culture, don't try to go do a new form. Because ultimately it's just a different form, and it's not gonna do anything massively different until disciple making is this heartbeat that's underneath. So Rob said he was sharing like the short story of the underground launch earlier. When we moved here, one of our best mates was like, you know, he had been spending, I think, 6 or 7 years before, at least 5 years before Rob got here, of creating this disciple making undercurrent in the church that we were a part of. Is mega church, 4,500 people on a weekend. And he had set out to make new and better small group leaders, but he accidentally created a disciple making pathway that multiplied out to the fourth generation on multiple strands, and out to even, you know, the seventh and eighth generation on a few. Like, he had great grandchildren, and it was never announced from the platform. It was never in any kind of bulletin or on the website. It was an invitational process into basically a 12-person cohort for 6 months that just multiplied itself over and over and over again into the character and in the calling and the gifts of Jesus aligning their life to his. And so I think when you got here, Rob, it was like 700 or 800 people that have been through this experience. And by the time we left, it was like 1,200. And so it's this rich disciple making culture that we planted mission inside of. Like, the soil was just rich. Not that they weren't already living missionally. Mm-hmm. We just lined it up to go, like, you're already sort of living like a missionary. Now go deep into a pocket of people or into a neighborhood. And so it's like we always say, the underground went back like a decade, you know, because had he not been making disciples that we were able to invite to live like missionaries in their neighborhood, so that they could speak the gospel to people that weren't coming to a weekend. And then these people gave their lives to Jesus and needed a family to exist within. No microchurch would have ever emerged, right?
You know, I think that's a really encouraging kind of story that you share, because, you know, a lot of church workers today live with a tension. They live with a tension of wanting to see more mission, wanting to see more multiplication happen, not knowing where to begin, stuck in existing frameworks that might or might not be working. Majority of training kind of moves toward, you know, these existing frameworks that everybody is at the same time saying, hey, these don't work anymore. They're so you would say the best place to, sorry, I broke up a little bit, but you would say the best place to begin would be in a disciple-making pathway, getting really intentional with disciple making and seeing where the Spirit takes it.
Yeah, the best transition is more like the yeast in the dough that Jesus talked about. You know, he said the kingdom is like yeast, and yeast is pretty invisible to the naked eye once it's in the dough, but it's slowly lifting and elevating, raising the whole loaf. And basically what happened at the church we were at is, like Brian said, there was these little pockets of disciples, like following Jesus' method. Let's get them in groups of 12, and then you have a triad within it. And in this first journey, it's called Followers Made. It's built around this idea that the Spirit is changing us. And the Spirit, according to Paul, seems to work in two big areas: fruit of the Spirit and gifts of the Spirit. So that's character and calling. So we need to partner with the Spirit in those outcomes. And as I'm growing in character and calling, character times calling equals impact, both in me and through me. And we need to learn spiritual habits that are focused on those outcomes, H2O, right? I'm not just doing spiritual habits as an end in and of themselves. Like, I read my Bible every day this week. No, I'm doing it so my character is more like Jesus, and I'm going deeper in mission, in my calling. And through a lot of experiments, it's called the intentional disciple making environment. This 6-month journey of learning to be a disciple who could make disciples, like Brian said, it started to kick in like yeast in the dough in that congregation. And then we keep increasing kind of the missionality of those IDEs. Like we started teaching the bless rhythms and inserted that into that disciple making pathway. And then we created a whole new 4-month journey that's about just learning the bless rhythms, going deeper into context. And eventually over time, microchurches started to emerge out of that work. You know, so it wasn't like we got up one day and said, we're going to do microchurches. It's actually was like, okay, we're doing disciple making, we're training missionaries, and microchurches start to emerge. And then we eventually created a training pathway just for microchurches. And so I would encourage anyone who's in the prevailing model, like, it really starts with you finding your 12 and having a really intentional disciple making environment. And if people are curious, they can go to disciplesmade.com. The different intentional disciple making environments we've created are actually all available in an app for other people to use if they're interested.
You said disciplesmade.com.
Yep.
And can you also find that in the App Store, or is it online?
It's actually it's a web app it's a subscription-based model, you know, so like you basically, a local church can sign up for a subscription. It's really dirt cheap. We wanted to make it affordable for a church of any size. And you get all the IDs that we've created. Intentional disciple making environments are in there. It's pretty amazing. It's like a combination of YouVersion, Udemy, like What's Up,
WhatsApp, yeah.
And because you get in basically in a group of 12 with 3, and then you're practicing your spiritual habits together. And there's actually a dashboard, so I can see, like, how are my 3 and 12 doing. You're regularly reflecting on both your character and also doing a calling assessment. So we've developed a calling assessment process, so it's a really powerful tool.
That's incredible. And you said it's Disciples Made.
I posted it in the chat as well.
.com.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I was gonna tag some to the end of what Rob was saying too. It's like the hub emerged much later. You know, it's disciple making. Turns out microchurches emerged. We need a hub to support the flourishing of those microchurches, to see those believers come to maturity and the multiplication. So the hub that we work for is kind of the final phase where we said, now that we've got 4, we need to start thinking about a hub. Now that we have 16, we need these teams that support those hubs. And now we need to think about multiple hubs in the city. But the organizational side only exists to support the continued multiplication of that decentralized network.
Well, I think that's huge, because oftentimes when we think about something like this, we go backwards. We are, then I'm going to move, kind of down from there. And what you're saying is start with the simplest, most basic form and work up, like grow into what you need.
Right.
Exactly. It's about first multiplying disciples. And if someone becomes a disciple and makes disciples, then they become a leader. First multiply disciples, and then you multiply leaders. If you're multiplying disciples and leaders, guess what's going to emerge?
Microchurch.
And then if you multiply microchurches, you're going to get networks of microchurches that we call collectives. And then you're going to need the multiply hubs to support the multiplying disciples, leaders, microchurches, and networks. That's the framework that we have in our mind. It's basically we're multiplying at all 5 levels, but the most important level is multiplying disciples. Everything rises and falls with that. And you're right. We've kind of got this backwards way of seeing things organizationally inside the church, where it's like, well, I start with the organization, so I'm going to build the hub, and then we'll do it's like, no, it actually starts with you discipling 12 people and helping them become disciple makers.
Wow. That's huge. I love that thought and concept. And then too, it's way more viral, because you're not dumping a couple $1 million to create a hub that doesn't have anybody yet. You're launching out people. And I guess probably most of your people are this is not their full-time vocation.
It's a co-vocational, bivocational model. There aren't any like paid microchurch leaders. It doesn't work like that. It's just ordinary people living on mission.
That's huge. So I guess a couple kind of rapid fire questions as we kind of round up. Roughly, how does it make that shift to microchurch, and then what do the microchurches do?
Try that question one more time.
Yeah. So, about how many are in a microchurch? When does it actually shift into microchurch? And then what are they doing differently when they're microchurch versus when they were just kind of gathering?
We can't put a number on how many are in a microchurch because they're all different. So one of them might have 6 or 7 people because it's very specific to a very hard context, whatever that network is. The LGBTQ plus one is like 6 or 7 to 8 people. And it's just a harder environment. These people have felt marginalized and hurt by the church for so long. It's a very slow process for the disciple making she's doing. Chad, that leads the rodeo community, they're probably around like 100, right? I mean, it's like there's these families that they've been this little gypsy band out in western Kansas for so long, and now he leads them as, kind of the spiritual father. And I'd hit a pause button. We've been sort of joking about that this week a couple of times. It's like, I want to be sensitive to this, but like contextually in the world, this is an important point. If you were just to go stereotypes, those 2 communities that I just mentioned aren't showing up to the same building. Like I'm admitting that's a stereotype, right? But like the assumption of like my value for that lifestyle or those people from both angles is like, but we've created a network where they exist together because they're autonomous. They're planning the gospel within their network. They're held together by a commitment to the Apostles' Creed, to these values of Jesus and Scripture and the poor. But but they're able to exist within the same number. So your first question was how many? It's like, well, how many disciples have you made, and what are the rhythms of that microchurch, and when did it multiply and move to a new, so there were 25 of us, but we just multiplied because we sent a missionary out with a core team. So now there's 8 of us again, but we've got new people that are rolling in. So it's like, depends on when you ask the question,
And there's different like layers to the microchurch. Like you'll have sort of, in most microchurches at the center, like ours, there's 20 to 25 people that are intentionally following Jesus together. But if we throw a party, a bunch more people from our neighborhood to show up.
Yeah.
Those party environments where you build relationship, credibility, start having spiritual conversations, and people come into more of that immediate spiritual family at the center. And I think that's very common for microchurches. Like if they're doing kind of a social space event, and I say event, it's like a party or a serve. They may have, like, I know Brian's had parties with 100 people or 200 people, and we consider those folks like at some level a part of our microchurch. Like we wouldn't say they're disciples following Jesus, but man, those are the people God has sent us to, and we love them like family, and we're inviting them deeper in, you know?
And the shift from when they weren't a microchurch to when they are is when we can clearly see the rhythms demonstrated of worship, community, and mission. So a team might be coming together like Carol's was with the LGBTQ. It's like she's got this small team of 2 to 3 that's praying, Jesus, we know you're at work in this community. We have relationships. We can name names. We know these people. It's not just an idea, but they're like, it's 2 to 3 that are praying. That's a missional team. And we count that missional team, and we're coaching them that way. And they've got community together. They're sharing meals, and they're on mission, right? But like the rhythms of those, like worship, community, and mission, and they're happening sort of in their own independent things. When those things begin to collide and new disciples are emerging, and it's like, well, our worship and community are happening more in rhythm and in sync with a team. And now we have new disciples that are coming, and we've got another circle of people that we're influencing because these people have committed to Jesus and are walking in his ways. We're like, that looks like a church to me. And then we begin to coach them in different ways.
So what you're describing is kind of this mix of like intentional coaching, but intentional coaching around what you're seeing happen, not what you're trying to generate.
Microchurches have meetings, but it's not about a weekly meeting, and typically we say when they can demonstrate like 2 out, 2 up, and 2 in terms of those rhythms, and those are consistent. It's like when your heartbeat is consistent, it's a vital sign. Right? So it's like they're doing 2 out, 2 up, 2 in, and it's rhythmic, and they're making new disciples, and they're connected to us and the eldership of the underground, then it's a church.
And when you say 2 up, 2 out, 2 in, you're talking about time rhythm, like monthly rhythm, like
every 4 to 6 weeks is what we say.
Cool. And then what does it look like for somebody to officially become a microchurch in the underground? The leaders submitting to the elders of the underground? Are they agreeing to like a minimal ecclesiology? Like what kind of, I guess, ties it all together?
So Rob mentioned that we have this missionary commitment. We also have a microchurch commitment. And so it's the missionary commitment is I commit to these things toward this network and multiplying disciples. The microchurch commitment is we've demonstrated worship, community, mission. You can see these rhythms played out. And they sign a commitment that says, as a microchurch, here are the things we commit to: the Apostles' Creed, the Lausanne Covenant, the Manifesto. We agree to that multiplication mindset. And then we as the underground commit back to that microchurch. You have access to our teams. We do these things for you. We will give you a coach, assign you a coach, but you have to connect with that coach. And a microchurch leader will sign that agreement, and then they get one other person from their microchurch to sign it. So it's not like I'm a microchurch and nobody else in my microchurch knows. Because it also demonstrates that level of disciple making and multiplication, so that there's we know you all agree on that, and somebody's not just making this up. You know.
Right. Oh, that's huge. That's huge, man. I mean, I could pick your guys' brains all day, but I appreciate the time you've given us. What's the next best place for people to go if they want to learn more about how to do the rhythms kind of that you're talking about? You gave us disciplesmade.com. Is there another spot that people should check out?
Yeah, kcunderground.com. I just put it in the chat. There's a type form there. You'll click in with get started, or anyway, you just fill out that type form, and we'll try to set up a Zoom call with you and encourage you in those.
We have a podcast as well.
Oh yeah,
people want to subscribe to that.
Yeah, and I saw that. So you can get to the podcast through the website, but what's the podcast called offhand?
The KC Underground Podcast.
Very uncreative title.
KC Underground Podcast. You guys probably won't remember that, so we'll send it out in the update. But well, Brian, Rob, I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time, for pouring into us. If you guys like what you heard or were intrigued, you want to share it with somebody else, we're sharing a follow-up PDF. We're sharing this on demand. It'll also be on the Life of a Church Planter website. That's lifeofachurchplanter.com. So you guys can check that out. And man, you guys have just, if anything, I feel like I've grown tremendously just getting to sit at your feet. So thank you for taking the opportunity, Brian, Rob, and just blessings on what God is doing in your ministry.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It was a privilege, a joy.
Thank you.